Hello everyone. So today I want to talk about strategy in global environment. So basically this lecture is about how companies expand internationally and why they should actually expand international when they have the possibility to do so. So I'm going to talk about a variety of different topics. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the effect of globalization. So the fact that more and more countries are open, and therefore this allowed many businesses to expand to new countries, to expand into other locations, and therefore be able to actually expand their operations. And when we say operations, that does not necessarily mean sell. Might just mean, for example, expanding the production itself. So globalization had two major implications because it allowed us to expand not just production, which means that now companies can have parts of their production all over the world, but also to expand to new markets, which means to reach new customers. All right. So this has increased the company's advantage, and they took advantage. This has increased because companies took advantage of what we call the lowering of entry barriers, because countries made it easier for companies to come to their countries, and governments aided that by allowing companies to more easily invest in their countries. So national markets started to merge into one big global market like we see nowadays, and it became much easier, for example, for me to go online and be able to buy something from the US, even though I'm in Europe, and get that product here. Now, 20 years ago, this would be almost not impossible, but it would be extremely difficult because it would take such a long time and there would be paperwork and so on. But nowadays, because of the lower international barriers, it's much easier. But there are two major implications here we have to be aware. If it's easier for us to go to another country, it's also easier for other companies to come to our location. And therefore, what we notice is that countries now have much more competition. All right. So this means that it became mandatory to improve our competitive advantage, to either become really good at efficiency, at customer care, or at quality, or at innovation ability, because those are the four main things that you can actually focus to make your company good. So from the previous slide, we saw as well that a country has four main characteristics that make it unique. So four things that make it competitive. Those four things are factors of endowment, local demand conditions, related and supporting industries, and firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. So these are the four conditions that basically point out what is the competitive position of a specific country. Now, every country will have its good things and its bad things, obviously, but what I mean here is that there are countries that for specific situations are better than others. For example, if you want to expand in terms of textile production, then China is much better, for example, than Germany. Why? Because it has cheaper labor, because it has already infrastructures, because it has a lot of companies on the field, and so on, so on. So therefore, there are countries that are better than others for specific things, which kind of makes sense, right? So what are these four things indeed? Let's start with factors of endowment. So this is nation's position in factors of production necessary to compete in an industry. Now, some industries require specific factors of production. Now, we can talk about raw materials, for example. If I have a company that produces something related to steel, and therefore I need a lot of steel and a lot of iron to be able to operate, then being located in a country that has mines of iron would be much more beneficial to me than being located in a country that doesn't, obviously. All right, but it does not necessarily need to be just raw materials. Can also be, for example, labor. Countries that have high skill of labor in specific areas might be much more interesting than others. So for example, it might be more interesting for a research company to be operated in France than to be, for example, operated in Pakistan. All right, obviously there's many good researchers in Pakistan, but the problem is that it would be much easier to find qualified labor in France rather than, for example, in Pakistan. But at the same time, Pakistan would have other factors of production that France does not have. So every country is indeed unique because every country will have its own characteristics. Now, the second characteristic is local demand conditions, and this basically means that will there be enough customers in that country to support the business? Now, you might decide to operate your factory, for example, or your business in a specific country, and you might say, oh, I'm going to be selling all my production abroad. All right, but things change. All right, For example, in the recent coronavirus outbreak, it meant that many businesses had to close, or many businesses cannot now sell abroad because there's many restrictions in terms of trade as well. So what is the issue here? It's always good to have customers that are in the local market. Divide the risk. Don't try to put all your eggs in one basket, like we say, by only relying on customers that actually are on another country. So make sure that you can find as well some local demand for your products. Third is related and supporting industries. Does the country have all the necessary industries that you need to proceed to your normal business? Okay, so this is the presence or absence of nations of suppliers and related industries that are internationally competitive. In other words, if you open your business in that country, can you find the necessary suppliers that you need to support your business? And finally, the fourth one is the firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. So here we talk about basic conditions in terms of governing in the country. Typically, how are companies created, how are they organized, how are they managed? All right, managing a company, for example, in Russia is very different from managing a company in Latin America, and therefore all these things will affect. All right, but it also has to do with the nature of the national rivalry as well. There are some countries that have industries that are very competitive, other countries where the industry is much less competitive. For example, the beer market in Portugal is extremely competitive because it's dominated pretty much by just two brands. And every time some new brand tries to come in, it is quite an intense fight. And many international brands decide not to go to Portugal because it would be too much of a rivalry intensification for the potential profits that they could get. So, as you can see, this is the four elements that define the strategic position of the country. Now, in terms of going global, all right, so there's many advantages to go global, to go multinational, okay, and really one of the main things is that companies can really, obviously, finding new customers. I think that one I don't even have to mention, but one of the major advantages is the fact that you can actually lower your costs. And that means, for example, you can spread your fixed costs and set up production facilities all over the globe, which means that if you have a particular business that is labor intensive, you can close that business and expand it to countries where, for example, the cost of labor is lower. You can serve a more global market, and a company can utilize its production facilities more intensively, because if now you have more customers all over the globe, that also means you can use your factories or your production facilities more at peak. In other words, more at efficiency. You can bargain down costs of key inputs with suppliers, because also if you are more global, that means that you probably can manage your logistics better, and therefore you have a wider range of suppliers that typically would not have. And finally, you can also increase your sales volume much more rapidly, obviously. And there's a extra one here that is not there, which is basically you are able to lower your risk. Going global actually is less risky than just staying in one market. Why? Because the moment you go global, the moment that you have income coming from 2 or 3 different countries, if one of those countries, for example, suddenly has an economic crisis or a problem, then you don't lose all your sales. Rather, you just lose a part of it. And this decreases the amount of risk you have. Now, in terms of location economies, here we're talking about the fact that some economic benefits arise from performing specific activities in the best location. So, for example, we could say that for textile production, China is the best place in the world because, well, it has the lowest costs. If we're talking, for example, about IT development, we could talk about India and so on. Okay, so all these things about doing the right task on the right place means that it allows me to lower my costs, to make my products different as well, because I can focus better on the products that I create, and also to gain a competitive advantage that will basically create a distinctive competency, because unlike my competitors, I'm able to produce something, or I have input from all over the globe, and therefore I have a much more wide range of ideas. This is much harder to manage, obviously, but at the same time, that does not mean that it's impossible. And therefore, if it was easy, everyone would do it, obviously, but the main advantage is the value that it can actually create. But obviously, one of the major problems we have here is always the transportation costs and the trade barriers that can be on these processes. So what managers need to do in terms of leveraging. If you are present in many different countries, then you have input from many different perspectives, and that's an advantage that many companies sometimes don't manage well. The main advantage here is that by having different cultures present in your company, that means you have different points of view over the same problem. So what managers need to do in order to harvest these skills is they can do four main things. Number one is, first of all, they have to realize that valuable skills can arise anywhere in the globe. And that means that just because a worker is in the headquarters does not mean that all the ideas will come from headquarters. You might have good ideas coming from subsidiaries. Second is the fact that establish an incentive system that can encourage local employees to acquire new competencies. In other words, you need to have some kind of system that people feel motivated to learn or to get new competencies in order as well to develop the company. Because remember, there's two advantages here. Number one, when an employee feels that they are in a company where they are also learning, statistically speaking, is more likely they stay long term in the company. And number two, the new knowledge that they get also generates value for the company. The third part, or the third action managers can take, is to have a process for identifying valuable new skills created in subsidiaries. In other words, to have a system that allows you to find out the key elements or the key people or the key skills that are valuable for the company. The better the system basically means the sooner you'll be able to detect these skills. Finally, the last thing is to create a system that allows valuable skills to be transferred within the firm. Maybe an exchange program, maybe a visiting program where employees from subsidiary can come from to the headquarters and vice versa. Now, I want to talk with you now about cost and response. And basically, this means that a company will always face two pressures. Number one is the pressure to reduce costs. This is a pressure that is constant and is very intense, especially when you are in an industry related to commodity products, or when you have products that serve universal needs, like, for example, toilet paper or water, or like printing paper, for example, and so on. So what we need to understand is that when we have major competitors when major competitors are based in low-cost location, there's also an excess capacity, and consumers always face a very low switching cost. What does that mean? It means that when you are in this type of industry, then there's a major problem here. The higher the pressure to lower your cost, because your product is very similar to the product of your rival, that means for the consumer, it does not make any difference to switch brands. For example, most people don't mind switching brands of toilet paper. Most people don't mind switching brands of salt, for example. Why? Because in their point of view, they're all the same. It's just a matter of price. Okay, other things, for example, like paper for printers, or for example, olive oil, all those things are things that typically are very commodity based. There's no big difference between one brand and another. I'm not saying this exemplifies for everyone, but for the large population, for the community, typically it is like this, and we work a lot with these rules of these general communities, let's say. So this is the first pressure. The second pressure we have is the customer pressure, the pressure we have to adapt the products to their needs. And the firm here, sometimes they have to differentiate their products or their marketing from country to country, because it does not work well. I remember when I was a kid back in Portugal. As you know, Portugal is right next to Spain. It's the only country we have a border with. And Spain is much bigger than Portugal is. So many brands actually would go to Portugal with the same exact commercial as Spain, and all they would do would be a voiceover over the commercial. And this did not work at all. People, they were trying to save costs, but the reality is they did not understand that actually people in Portugal did not like that, because in a way, it made feel like the commercial was just a recycling of something they were doing somewhere else. So here, there was a high pressure, and companies quickly realized they had to create their own commercials for the Portuguese market, because the Portuguese market was very different from the Spanish market. So here, the problem with this is the fact that these kind of responses will increase your costs. If I have to do a different marketing campaign, and if I have to adapt my product for every country, there's going to be higher costs. And therefore, here we're going to have three main reasons why this will happen. Well, first of all, there's differences in customers' case between countries. Number two, there's differences in terms of distribution channels, the way that you make your product reach your customer in each country. So for example, maybe in a country, Amazon might be the best distribution channel, but in another country, Amazon does not exist, for example. And finally, it can also have to do with the government demands. Some countries have rules about specific distribution of specific products that don't apply to other countries. So as you can see, there's two main pressures here on a company, and they are both, they're the opposite of each other. Because if I want to make my company more customer responsive, then the cost will go up. So what we see is that there's four major strategies when it comes to these type of pressures. So in terms of pressure for local responsiveness, it can be low or high, and in terms of pressure for cost reduction, it can be low or high as well. So we're going to start one by one with the global standardization strategy. So this is a business model that is related to pursuing a low-cost strategy on a global scale. In other words, we sell the same product all over the world, and companies here market a standardized product worldwide, and they try to reap the maximum benefits they can by achieving economies of scale. And this is very appropriate when the pressure for cost reductions are strong and the demand to adapt your products is low. And a great example of that is IKEA. Now, I'm not saying that IKEA does not adapt their products. Yes, they do have some products that are specific to certain countries, but like, I don't know, maybe 95-99% of their products is the same all over the world. How do they make money? They make money by producing that one product so much that the cost of that product is much lower than the price they can sell it by. The second one we have is called localization strategy. This is focused on increasing profitability by customizing the company's goods according to the local market. This is appropriate when consumer tastes and preferences are very different from country to country, for example, or location to location, and when cost pressures are not that strong. And I think one of the companies that does this very well is Airbnb. Airbnb adapts their offers to different countries, and this is also have to do with the supply of products from that country. And I think that they manage this diversity quite well. There is a pressure of cost, but that pressure of cost is not so much on Airbnb, but more on the suppliers of products or on the people that rent things or on Airbnb. So the benefit here is that the value of the product rises very strongly in local markets, but at the same time there's a limitation. It's very hard to achieve economies of scale here because especially in Airbnb, they cannot, a hotel, for example, they would reduce their costs by building bigger hotels. But Airbnb does not have that option. They don't have the option to actually be able to lower costs. So that's one of the main limitations that they have. The third one is called the transnational strategy. This is when a company has to do two things at the same time. They have to achieve low costs, but they also have to differentiate the product offering across a geographic market, and they have to foster the flow of skills between all these global subsidiaries. It is very difficult to do it because you have both to adapt the product and maintain low costs. And I think the company that does this the best is a company P&G, because they really adapt their products to different markets. There's many products from P&G that only sell in specific markets. And at the same time, on those markets, even though they adapt, they are still able to maintain very low costs. Okay. But indeed, it is very hard to pursue this because it's a conflict here. You have to adapt and maintain low costs at the same time. The final one is called the international strategy, and this is when a company establishes manufacturing and marketing operations in every single country that they have to operate with. And this is extremely hard, as you can imagine. It's very hard to achieve economies of scale if every time I go into a new country I have to open a new factory or a new center. Here, local customization of the product offering and the market strategy is limited in scope, which means like there's not many things you're gonna have to adapt, but you're not gonna have to adapt in everything. And this type of strategy is most appropriate when you have products that serve universal needs or when companies are not confronted too much with cost pressures. And I think that here a great example of a company that does that is the company Xerox, the photocopy machine brand, that basically they every time they go into a new country they need to have a maintenance center for these machines, and they also have to adapt to the marketing because they sell mostly to businesses, and therefore they always have to adapt to how the local businesses work. So what we see here is that typically, when an industry starts, or at the very beginning of the industries, when the industries are still relatively small, a company will typically enter either with an international strategy or with a localization strategy. And here, but the thing is, as time goes by and more competitors arise, there's two major options here. If you start with international strategy, you might move into a global standardization strategy if the pressure to adapt your product maintains on the low level. Or you might move into a transnational strategy if not only the pressure for cost is high, but also the pressure to adapt your product to the local market also increases. On the other hand, localization strategy will always evolve towards a transnational strategy and will never evolve into a global standardization strategy. Why? Because that would mean that the pressure to adapt your product to local markets would be reduced, and that does not happen. If there is the pressure from the start for your product to be adapted, then it's going to maintain and it's not going to change. So now, in terms of entry mode, what is the best way to enter a new market? Well, there's a couple of different options that you have to start a business in a new country or to expand. The first one is exporting. That's the easiest one. Okay, I'm going to explain them from the simplest to the most complex one, but at the same time from the lowest returns to the maximum possible returns. So the easiest one is always exporting. You simply maintain operations in your country, but then you export the service or the product to another country. In other words, you don't actually have a physical location in the country you're selling to. Okay, so here profit is a little bit more limited, but it's the least amount of risk you have. If you want to take a little bit more risk, you can do licensing. Now, licenses, they purchase the rights to produce a company's product in their country for a fee. In other words, you have a product, but you don't want to open a factory in another country. You might find someone who wants to produce your product there in their country and to sell it themselves, and therefore they would just pay you, for example, a fee. Well, a company that uses this a lot is Disney. Probably you notice there's thousands and thousands of different Disney products, but Disney does not produce all that. What they do is they sell the license to produce those items to specific factories or to specific companies, and then they make a commission or a royalty. The next one is called franchise, which I'm sure you already know. Franchise is specialized. It's a special form of license where the franchisor is expected to obey a certain set of rules in terms of management of their own businesses. And this is the difference between licensing, because in licensing there's no pressure in terms of how you should manage the business. Joint venture, on the other hand, is a partnership. This happens when two businesses work together, typically 50-50. So company A, company B want to go to a country, but they don't want to invest the whole money themselves. So they decide to join forces and create a new company, company C, that will enter that market. And company C is owned half by company A and half by company B. So this is a way to divide the risk, but the problem obviously is that you also divide the profits. And finally, the most risky, but at the same time the one that can give the highest profit, is wholly owned subsidiary. This is when a company basically goes and enters the whole market by themselves, and they invest all the money by themselves. So each one of them has advantages and disadvantages, and I encourage you to pause the video and actually read all the advantages and all the disadvantages. Each one of them should be used on very particular situations, and it's not like there's only one possible solution for a problem. There's always one situation can have 3 or 4 or even all the 5 of them different solutions. But what happens is, depending on what I decide to do, I'm going to have to take different actions to adapt. A company that is going to export is going to have to do much less work, for example, than a company that decides to do a joint venture or a franchise. So some special cases that I want to mention here. If a company's distinctive ability is related to technology or to know-how or know how to do stuff, never do licensing, because when you do licensing, you have to give away your secret. You have to give away how you do things. And if your major advantage is that, then you would be incorporating into a huge mistake. Then, in terms of franchise and subsidiaries for service industry, in terms of the service industry, sorry, what we notice is that licensing and franchise works really well, especially the hotel industry, which is my specialty. We see that, for example, many companies have decided to go specifically with this. Marriott, for example, many years ago, they decided to pretty much sell all their hotels and become a management company. So Marriott actually owns very little hotels. When I say hotels, I mean the building itself. They are owned by investors that then pay a commission to Marriott for Marriott to manage their hotels. And this is very different from other businesses like, for example, the Group Accor. Group Accor owns most of their properties, and therefore they also keep most of the money generated by the hotels itself. Other special cases here to consider is that companies that pursue a global or a transnational strategies, they normally prefer to establish a wholly owned subsidiary. And this has many reasons: to protect their information, to have more control, but at the same time, and most of the times, is because that way it allows them to keep all the profits to themselves. The last topic for today is about alliances or international alliances. This is cooperation agreements between companies from different countries that are actually competitors. And we see this a lot on the airline industry. Like for example, if you think about Star Alliance, it's a organization of many different airlines, and all the airlines in Star Alliance, they're all competitors to each other. So why do they work together? Well, there's many advantages to work together. Number one, it facilitates the fact that companies now can enter into a new market. So for example, it allows a company in Star Alliance to go to pretty much anywhere in the world without actually having to have a plane to go there. And that means that it saves a lot of money if you work in partnership with other people. Why have two planes that are half empty travel when you could just have one plane that is full? So it also allows firms to share the cost of developing new products and processes. For example, two airlines or three airlines might decide to share the costs and the profit of one specific route rather than having the three of them operating individually that route at the same time. So as you can see, there's many advantages of working with international alliances. They can bring together as well skills and assets. They can help establish new technological standards, but obviously there are disadvantages as well. And the main one is that it gives competitor a very low cost route for new technologies and new markets, and therefore the best way to explain is that you are actually helping your competition, and if you're helping your competition, then you're making your position worse. So here it's a matter of seeing what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages, and then answering the question, is it worth it? All right, and with that we finish our video. We covered quite a lot of different things. Okay, we covered why companies go international, what are the type of general strategies that they follow, what are the entry modes that you can have, and what is the importance of strategic alliances. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you have any good examples of companies that follow one of these strategies that we spoke about. Leave the example on the comment section below. I always love to check new examples that I don't know yet. Or if you have any questions as well, just feel free to drop a comment, and I'll make sure to answer it as quickly as possible. All right, in the meantime, I hope you had fun, and I'll see you on the next video.